And welcome back, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another First and 15 Fantasy Football Podcast. This is injury news and strategies for your 2022 fantasy football season. This is where we'll be diving into current injury news and previous injuries to see whether they're going to be affecting or influencing their current season. We are now finishing up the last team in the AFC South, the Indianapolis Colts. Let's jump right in. And welcome back to another episode of First and 15 Fantasy Football Podcast, looking into your injury news and draft strategies for your 2022 fantasy football season. We're going to be covering now your last team in your AFC South, your Indianapolis Colts. This is going to be your last team in your AFC entirely as we continue to move on into the NFC in your next coming videos. But as we look into the Indianapolis Colts, we're going to be looking to see whether, a key acquisition at the wide receiver group, a key acquisition at the quarterback helm, if there's going to ultimately influence the consistency and power of Jonathan Taylor, your number one overall fantasy football player. But let's dive right into the Indianapolis Colts. The Indianapolis Colts started off this season last year with a 9-8 record. Just one game above 500. But you ultimately did see the likes of Jonathan Taylor breaking out onto the fantasy football platform and becoming your number one overall fantasy football player for this coming season. As we all know, also, they traded away Carson Wentz over to the Commanders and now have Matt Ryan over from the Atlanta Falcons. So we're going to ultimately see, how that unfolds and how that plays out as training camp unfolds and practice continues to develop over the preseason weeks. So let's jump right into Matt Ryan and kind of what he did last year and what we think he's going to be bringing into kind of what this year for this fantasy football season. Matt Ryan was able to stay relatively healthy last year playing for the Atlanta Falcons. He did not miss any games. He did put an overall fantasy score of 268 points. He did add 40 rushes at 82 yards with 375 completions, 560 attempts at 3,968 yards. He was able to put in 20 pass TDs overall last year. And so we're looking to see, obviously with a better O-line and then now with the likes of Jonathan Taylor and the wide receiver group to determine whether that's going to increase the effectiveness of Matt Ryan. Ultimately, he's going to be put in a position where he's going to be successful and managing the game entirely. From Frank Wright opening the playbook to feeling comfortable to allow Matt Ryan to call many plays throughout the playbook because Matt Ryan has the IQ and intelligence to run that and has the capacity to run those type of things on the field in a veteran-like status. And so that will ultimately lead to the successes of Jonathan Taylor, the tight end group themselves, the wide receiver core, and in your other and Naheem Hines in the same fashion for your passing attack. And so we're looking for Matt Ryan to have, another fantastic season. Right now in your best ball leagues, he's going anywhere between your 13th and your 15th rounds. In your redraft leagues, he's going anywhere between your 24th and your 25th quarterback overall. In Superflex leagues, he's going anywhere between 4th and 5th rounds. And so, again, we're looking for Matt Ryan to hopefully continue on with the production from last year and then add his veteran status to this team of the Indianapolis Colts. But we're not looking for only Matt Ryan to be the only one going for the Indianapolis Colts. We're looking for Jonathan Taylor to continue to pick up from that breakout season he had last year and continue to make a fantasy splash this year and live up to his fantasy expectations. Right now, Jonathan Taylor is your number one overall consensus fantasy football player. In PPR formats, there is obviously a debate whether it's Cooper Kupp, whether it's CMC, but Jonathan Taylor definitely makes a definite case for being the number one overall fantasy football player. Jonathan Taylor was able to stay relatively healthy last year. He did not miss any games. He was able to put in 337 fantasy points, 40 receptions at 360 yards, and then adding 332 rushes at 1,811 yards, adding another 18 rush TDs and 2 reception TDs. And so if that doesn't scream out number one fantasy football production, and specifically now coming in with a quarterback who has a veteran status, who's been around specific running backs of this kind of stature, at least this kind of power and quickness and IQ, more specifically, is going to be able to now mentor him and then be able to and put him in positions to be even more productive. Last year they only gave him 40 receptions. Imagine if they were to give him at least 15 to 20 more receptions. And so that's only going to increase his fantasy production from last year and then ultimately put him in that top elite category for this coming season. So right now in your redraft leagues, Jonathan Taylor is your number one overall. In best balls, 1 and 2. And then in super flex leagues, he's going anywhere between your 6th and your 8th overall. And so we're looking to see that Jonathan Taylor lives up to his expectations. He's going to be behind a foundational line. He's going to be behind a veteran leader that is going to continue to give him opportunities to be successful and continue to make success in the offensive schemes for the Indianapolis Colts. The other running backs we're going to be talking about is obviously Marlon Mack being traded over to the Houston Texans. Obviously that frees up the depth chart, that frees up the backfield. And so, they're going to have a backfield of Jonathan Taylor, Nyheim Hines. You're going to have now Phillip Lindsay and then Tyson Williams. And so we're going to ultimately see now with that, running back depth chart is, we're going to see that 1-2 punch coming from Jonathan Taylor and Nyheim Hines. Nyheim Hines, there is, a lot of buzz coming around in the league coming from him, specifically from Frank Reich, and loving his, overall passing capacity. And so that might eat into Jonathan Taylor's capacity to catch passes. But ultimately, I do see that both of them are going to rise in response to Matt Ryan being now the quarterback and Frank Reich opening the playbook and then giving probably both of them on the field, Jonathan Taylor and Nyheim Hines. And so ultimately, they're going to be making more responsive and reactive to how the play develops. And then as the play develops, organically dish the ball and deliver the ball over to their key players. And that could be very well Nyheim Hines. And so Nyheim Hines right now, in your redraft leagues, he's going anywhere between 37th, 38th running back overall. In your best ball leagues, he's going anywhere between your 10th and your 11th rounds. And so I think as you hear more and more buzz coming from that camp, and then more and more you hear as Matt Ryan becomes a more veteran managing the game, then you're going to see that Nyheim Hines hopefully has a little bit more fantasy production coming from that running back 2 position. Your other running back of Phillip Lindsay and Tyson Williams, we're going to kind of see where they develop and how it kind of rolls out in training camp and as practice unfolds to determine whether these two individuals are going to have any type of fantasy relevancy. But that's going to be doing it for your running backs of your Indianapolis Colts. Let's now get into the wide receiver groups. The wide receiver core for the Indianapolis Colts is going to be led by Michael Pittman Jr. Last year he had a breakout season, going over 1,000 yards on his fantasy season. And so we're ultimately looking to see if Michael Pittman is going to continue on with that fantasy production into this coming season. He's going to be getting the likes of Paris Campbell. Hopefully, he stays healthy throughout this coming season, coming into his 4th season. And then also Alec Pierce, the rookie wide receiver coming from University of Cincinnati. But Michael Pittman, was able to stay relatively healthy all last season. He did not miss any games. He is right now in your redraft leagues going 13th wide receiver overall. There's a making case for going, number 11, all even all the way down to 13 or 14. And so in your best ball leagues, he's going in your 2nd and 3rd rounds. He did add last year 148, fantasy points, 5 rushes for 48 yards, 88 receptions, 129 targets for 1,082 yards. 6 reception TDs. And so, Michael Pittman did have a fantasy breakout season going over 1,000 yards, well over close to 100 catches. If you're going to be, close to 100 catches and over 1,000 yards, that is going to be a fantasy production line. And so ultimately we're going to see if Michael Pittman, with the likes of hopefully Paris Campbell staying healthy this coming season, if that's going to lead to more of an effectiveness for Michael Pittman. But Paris Campbell, like we said, was not able to stay anywhere healthy in the last three previous seasons for your Indianapolis Colts. He had been dealing with a lot of conditions that ultimately put him out for the rest of the season. And so Paris Campbell, did last year have a foot fracture that did require surgery, and this was done in October of 2021. Right now we're anticipating that he is fully healthy. In training camp, he is participating in full live action team drills. There has been no setbacks. In the previous seasons, Paris Campbell has had, an abdominal injury last year in week 2. He missed one game. Then he had that foot fracture in week 6 and missed the rest of the season. And then the previous season in 2020, he had a PCL injury in week 2, missed the rest of the season. He had a broken foot in 2019, and then also had a hand fracture in 2019. And so those are some really significant injuries that ultimately plagued him over the last 3 seasons of his career. Paris Campbell right now is in your redraft leagues going 80th overall wide receiver. In your best ball leagues, he's going anywhere between your 17th and your 20th rounds. And so we're going to want to see that he stays healthy and is able to stay, healthy throughout the season and continues to increase his fantasy production to stay fantasy relevant. And so ultimately, we'll keep a close eye on that and determine if Paris Campbell will be able to, ultimately give or at least deliver some fantasy production for the Indianapolis Colts. The other wide receivers for your Indianapolis Colts, that T.Y. Hilton is now a free agent. He has stated that he wants and intends to sign with the Indianapolis Colts this season, but right now, currently, he is still a free agent. Zach Pascal traded over to the Eagles, and so now you just have the likes of Michael Pittman, and you have Paris Campbell, and then you have Alec Pierce. Alec Pierce right now in your redraft leagues, he's going anywhere between 73rd overall wide receiver. And in your best ball leagues, he's going anywhere between your 11th and your 13th rounds. So he's a rookie wide receiver, about 6'3", coming over for University of Cincinnati. He doesn't have, blaring speed coming off the line, but he is a big individual. And if he's, taller and larger than the defensive back, he's going to ultimately win most of the jump balls, specifically in the red zone. And so Alec Pierce, we're going to see if he's going to ultimately add to the arsenal with the in-game management of Matt Ryan and continue to give the wide receiver core of the Indianapolis Colts, offensive production and then lead to some of these fantasy productions in your favor. But the last individuals I'd like to talk about are your tight ends for your Indianapolis Colts. As you all know now that Jack Doyle has retired, he's no longer a long-standing Indianapolis Colt as far as an active player. So now you're going to have the likes of Mo Alley-Cox. Mo Alley-Cox, is a large tight end. He's, coming in relatively healthy last year. He did not miss any games. Right now in your redraft leagues, he's going 28th overall as a tight end. Best ball leagues, he's going anywhere between your 17th and your 20th rounds. And so, he did add 24 receptions, 316 yards, 4 reception TDs. We're going to see now with the tight end position ultimately open with, Matt Ryan at the helm, leading to a more in-game management and hopefully leading to more offensive production from, the tight end and the passing attack itself, if that's going to ultimately lead to some more fantasy production from your tight ends. And so we'll continue to be looking at to see if the tight ends, or at least Mo Alley-Cox, continues to be a fantasy producer. Well, that will do it for your Indianapolis Colts. Hopefully that was a little bit more insightful, give you a little bit more information on to what to expect for this coming season. Jonathan Taylor being your number 1 overall consensus fantasy football player. Michael Pittman coming into his 3rd season with these Indianapolis Colts. Nyheim Hines adding to the passing and attacking capacity, and then also with your rookie wide receiver Alec Pierce to determine if Michael Pittman and the wide receiver core group continue to add more fantasy relevancy. But hopefully, again, that brought you more insight to the Indianapolis Colts. That'll be doing it for your AFC South. For your next episodes, we're going to be getting now into your NFC West. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for tuning in for another First and 15 Fantasy Football podcast. Again, this was injury news and strategies for your 2022 fantasy football season. We will now be diving into the NFC West. Make sure you stay tuned, and we'll catch you next time.